I'll never forget the moment my own mother looked me dead in the eye on Christmas morning and said, "Get out of my house, you ungrateful disappointment." What she didn't know was that I held the power to make that house disappear with a single phone call. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who forget exactly how much they depend on you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins 3 years ago when I was 24 and thought I finally understood my place in the Martinez family hierarchy. Growing up in Scottsdale, Arizona, I had always been the responsible daughter while my younger brother Kevin was the golden child who could do no wrong. When Kevin wanted to pursue his dream of becoming a professional photographer, my parents Patricia and Robert mortgaged their house to buy him expensive equipment and fund his studio. When I wanted to go to nursing school, they told me to figure it out myself because girls can always find a husband to support them. That particular comment stung more than usual because I had been dating Tyler Rodriguez for 2 years, and my parents constantly criticized him for not being Mexican enough, not making enough money, and not proposing fast enough. Tyler worked as a paramedic and was putting himself through fire academy training. But to my parents, he was just another disappointment in my long list of failures to meet their expectations. The first major crack in our family foundation appeared when Kevin announced he was engaged to Stephanie Walsh, a blonde marketing executive from Minnesota, whom he'd met at a photography workshop. My parents were overjoyed, immediately beginning plans for an elaborate engagement party and wedding that would cost more than most people's annual salary. They gushed about how beautiful their future grandchildren would be, how successful Stephanie was, and how proud they were that Kevin had chosen such a perfect partner. Meanwhile, when Tyler and I mentioned we were thinking about getting engaged, my mother's response was to suggest I lose 20 pounds first and find a man with better career prospects. She actually said this in front of Tyler during Sunday dinner, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. Tyler simply squeezed my hand under the table and changed the subject, but I could see the hurt in his eyes that he tried so hard to hide. The engagement party for Kevin and Stephanie was held at the Desert Ridge Country Club, a venue that cost more per night than I made in 2 months working as a medical assistant while attending nursing school part-time. My parents spared no expense, hiring a mariachi band, a professional photographer who wasn't Kevin, and a caterer who specialized in fusion Mexican-American cuisine that somehow managed to be both pretentious and flavorless. During the party, I watched my parents beam with pride as they introduced Stephanie to their friends and extended family. She was everything they had apparently wanted in a daughter-in-law: educated, financially successful, traditionally beautiful, and most importantly, someone who made Kevin look good by association. When people asked about my relationship status, my mother would quickly change the subject or make vague comments about how I was still figuring things out. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my parents were spending thousands celebrating Kevin's engagement, I was working double shifts to pay for my nursing prerequisite courses and help Tyler save money for fire department training. We had been talking seriously about marriage, but every conversation about our future was overshadowed by my family's obvious disapproval and Tyler's growing frustration with their treatment of both of us. 3 months after the engagement party, my parents faced their first real financial crisis. Robert's construction business hit a rough patch when 2 major clients defaulted on payments, leaving him unable to meet several large expenses, including the mortgage on their Scottsdale home. The house, a 4-bedroom ranch-style property with a pool and mountain views, had been their pride and joy for 15 years, but the mortgage payments had increased significantly when they refinanced to fund Kevin's photography business. I'll never forget the evening my father called me, his voice uncharacteristically shaky as he explained their situation. They were 3 months behind on mortgage payments and facing foreclosure within 60 days. The bank had been understanding initially, but patience was wearing thin and legal notices were arriving weekly. Kevin's photography business was struggling to generate consistent income, and Stephanie's marketing job, while well-paying, couldn't cover both their expenses and help with my parents' financial emergency. My father, a man who had always prided himself on providing for his family and never asking for help, was asking his daughter to co-sign a mortgage refinance that would lower their monthly payments and prevent foreclosure. The monthly payment would drop from $3,800 to $2,400, a significant reduction that would allow them to keep their home while Robert's business recovered. The decision wasn't easy. Co-signing meant taking legal responsibility for a debt that wasn't mine, putting my own financial future at risk for parents who had consistently made me feel like a secondary consideration in their lives. Tyler advised caution, pointing out that my parents had never shown the same willingness to invest in my success or well-being. But ultimately, the thought of my parents losing their home, the place where I had grown up and where family gatherings still occurred, was too painful to accept. I agreed to co-sign the refinanced mortgage, officially becoming equally responsible for monthly payments on a house I had never truly felt welcome in as an adult. The paperwork was completed through Marcus Thompson, a mortgage broker who explained in detail what co-signing meant for my credit, my debt-to-income ratio, and my ability to qualify for future loans. I signed documents that made me legally obligated to pay $2,400 every month if my parents defaulted, money I definitely didn't have while working part-time and attending school. My parents' gratitude was overwhelming initially. My mother actually hugged me, tears in her eyes as she thanked me for saving their home. My father, usually reserved with emotions, told me he was proud of my loyalty to family and promised they would never put me in a difficult position regarding the mortgage. For a brief moment, I felt like the daughter they had always wanted, worthy of their love and appreciation. The relief was short-lived. Within 2 months of the refinance, my parents' behavior returned to its previous patterns of favoritism and criticism. Kevin received praise for booking a single wedding photography job, while I received lectures about my career choices when I mentioned considering a transfer to a 4-year university to complete my nursing degree faster. When Tyler and I announced our engagement 6 months later, their response was notably lukewarm compared to the celebration Kevin had received. Our engagement announcement at Sunday dinner was met with polite congratulations followed immediately by concerns about timing, finances, and whether we were really ready for such a commitment. My mother suggested we wait until I finished nursing school and Tyler completed fire academy training, essentially asking us to postpone our lives for another 2 years while Kevin and Stephanie began planning their elaborate destination wedding in Cancun. The double standard became impossible to ignore when my parents offered to pay for Kevin and Stephanie's wedding, but suggested Tyler and I consider a simple courthouse ceremony followed by a small family dinner. When I pointed out the disparity in treatment, my mother's response was that Kevin was their son, and the family name would continue through him, while I would eventually belong to Tyler's family anyway. The casual dismissal of my place in their lives, despite having just saved their home from foreclosure, was devastating. Tyler watched these interactions with growing anger and protective instincts that my parents interpreted as possessiveness and control. They began making comments about how he was changing me, making me more confrontational and less respectful of family traditions. In reality, Tyler was simply supporting my growing awareness that unconditional love shouldn't require me to accept conditional respect. The situation deteriorated further when Kevin's wedding planning began consuming every family conversation and gathering. Sunday dinners became planning sessions for a wedding that would cost more than most people's annual salary, funded by parents, who had needed their daughter to co-sign their mortgage to avoid foreclosure just 18 months earlier. When I suggested the irony of this financial prioritization, I was accused of being jealous and unsupportive of my brother's happiness. Stephanie, to her credit, seemed uncomfortable with the obvious favoritism and made several attempts to include me in wedding planning activities. However, these gestures only highlighted how my parents directed most enthusiasm and resources toward celebrating her place in the family, while treating my engagement as an afterthought that required careful management rather than celebration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The breaking point was building slowly through a series of smaller incidents that individually seemed manageable, but collectively created an unbearable pattern of disrespect and dismissal. My parents had become comfortable taking my support for granted while openly questioning every decision Tyler and I made about our future together. They had forgotten that their home security depended entirely on my continued goodwill and financial responsibility. Christmas 2024 was approaching, and with it, what would become the most devastating and ultimately liberating 24 hours of my relationship with my parents. I had no idea that their treatment of me was about to cross a line that would finally force me to choose between family loyalty and personal dignity, or that the choice I made would reveal exactly how much power I had been quietly accumulating. While they continued to treat me as their least important child, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, triggered by my parents' assumption that their daughter would continue accepting disrespect in the name of family harmony. They had no idea that the grateful, compliant Jessica, who had co-signed their mortgage, was about to be replaced by someone who finally understood that love shouldn't require surrendering self-respect. What happened on Christmas morning would expose the true dynamics of our family relationships and force everyone to confront the consequences of years of favoritism, manipulation, and taking for granted the very person who had saved them from losing everything they claimed to value most. The months leading up to Christmas became a masterclass in how families can slowly poison relationships through 1,000 small cuts. What started as occasional favoritism evolved into a systematic pattern of dismissal that made every family interaction feel like walking through a minefield where only I seemed to step on the explosives. October brought the first major incident that should have served as a warning of what was coming. Tyler and I had finally saved enough money for a small engagement party at a local restaurant. Nothing elaborate, but meaningful to us. We invited both families, keeping the guest list modest because of our budget constraints. Tyler's parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, were genuinely excited and offered to help with decorations and bring homemade food to supplement what we could afford from the restaurant. When I called to invite my parents, the conversation immediately turned to logistics that felt more like an interrogation than planning assistance. My mother's first question wasn't about the date or time, but about the venue choice and why we hadn't selected somewhere more appropriate for a family celebration. When I explained our budget limitations, she made a comment about how Kevin and Stephanie had managed to have their engagement party at the country club despite Kevin's inconsistent income from photography. The implication stung because it was both untrue and deliberately hurtful. Kevin and Stephanie's party had been funded entirely by my parents, while Tyler and I were paying for our own celebration while also maintaining responsibility for my parents' mortgage payments. The comparison was not only unfair, but revealed how completely my mother had rewritten history to avoid acknowledging the financial assistance I provided to their household stability. My father's response was more subtle but equally damaging. He agreed to attend, but mentioned several times how busy his schedule was becoming with year-end construction projects and Kevin's wedding planning obligations. The message was clear. Our engagement party was a secondary priority that would receive whatever leftover attention remained after more important family matters were addressed. The evening of our engagement party arrived with Tyler and I both nervous about how our families would interact. Tyler's parents arrived early, bringing beautiful flowers and homemade tres leches cake that had taken Maria hours to prepare. They spent time talking with other guests, sharing stories about Tyler's childhood, and genuinely celebrating our relationship with warmth that made everyone feel welcome. My parents arrived 30 minutes late, which might have been acceptable, except they had stopped at Kevin and Stephanie's apartment first to discuss wedding catering options. They mentioned this casually during their apologies, as if it was perfectly natural to prioritize wedding planning over their daughter's engagement celebration. Throughout the evening, they maintained polite but distant demeanor, participating in conversations when directly addressed, but never initiating the kind of enthusiastic engagement that had characterized Kevin's party. The contrast became painfully obvious when Tyler's father Carlos stood to give a toast, celebrating our relationship and future together. His words were heartfelt and personal, sharing specific memories of Tyler's growth and expressing genuine excitement about welcoming me into their family. When he finished, there was a natural pause where my parents might have offered their own toast or words of celebration. Instead, my mother simply raised her glass with a polite smile, while my father checked his phone for messages. Later that week, I learned from Kevin that our parents had spent considerable time the next day discussing their concerns about Tyler's suitability as a husband and my readiness for marriage. According to Kevin, they felt Tyler wasn't ambitious enough and worried that I was settling for someone who would limit my future opportunities. The conversation had apparently included detailed speculation about whether our marriage would last, and how quickly I might return home when reality set in about adult responsibilities. November escalated the pattern with an incident that revealed how deeply my parents had internalized their hierarchy of family importance. Stephanie had planned a bridal shower for the weekend before Thanksgiving, an elaborate event at her friend's home in Paradise Valley that would include professional catering, a photographer, and gifts that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The shower was scheduled for the same weekend as Tyler's Fire Academy graduation ceremony, a milestone he had worked toward for over a year. When the scheduling conflict became apparent, I assumed there would be some discussion about how to handle the overlap. Tyler's graduation was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement that represented his transition into a career he was passionate about, while Stephanie's bridal shower was one of multiple pre-wedding celebrations planned over several months. The choice seemed obvious to me, but my parents saw the situation very differently. My mother called to discuss the conflict, but her tone made it clear this wasn't actually a discussion. She had already decided that I would attend Stephanie's shower because family obligations took precedence over boyfriend events, regardless of their significance. When I explained that Tyler's graduation was extremely important to both of us, and that I had already committed to being there, her response was immediate and harsh. She accused me of prioritizing Tyler over family, suggesting that my loyalty had shifted in unhealthy ways since our engagement. The conversation included pointed comments about how wives who put husbands before parents often find themselves isolated when marriages encounter difficulties. Most painfully, she suggested that missing Stephanie's shower would be seen as a rejection of Kevin's fiancé and could damage family relationships permanently. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and effective. By framing my choice as a betrayal of family unity rather than a conflict between two important events, my mother made it impossible for me to choose Tyler's graduation without seeming selfish and disloyal. The fact that Tyler's achievement was professional and personal growth, while Stephanie's shower was a social celebration, didn't factor into her analysis of appropriate priorities. I ultimately attended Tyler's graduation, a decision that resulted in 3 weeks of cold treatment from my parents and passive-aggressive comments about my changing values and misplaced loyalties. Tyler's graduation was beautiful and meaningful, surrounded by his family and fellow firefighters who understood the significance of his accomplishment. But the joy was tainted by knowing I was being punished for choosing to celebrate my fiancé's career milestone over my future sister-in-law's gift opening party. The punishment took subtle forms that were designed to communicate displeasure without creating opportunities for direct confrontation. Sunday dinner invitations became irregular and last-minute. Family group texts about holiday planning or Kevin's wedding updates would include everyone except me, requiring Kevin or Stephanie to relay information secondhand. When I called to check on mortgage payments or household matters, conversations were brief and businesslike rather than personal. December brought the crescendo of this building tension with Kevin and Stephanie's bachelor and bachelorette parties, events that consumed weeks of family attention and resources. Kevin's bachelor party involved a weekend trip to Las Vegas that my parents helped fund, while Stephanie's bachelorette party was a spa weekend in Sedona that cost more per person than Tyler and I spent on groceries in 2 months. During the planning for these events, my parents expressed concern about the expenses, while simultaneously bragging to friends and extended family about the elaborate celebrations their son was receiving. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. They worried privately about money while publicly celebrating their ability to provide Kevin with experiences that reinforced his status as the favored child. Meanwhile, Tyler and I were planning our own modest bachelor and bachelorette parties for the following spring, simple gatherings with close friends that would cost a fraction of Kevin's celebrations. When my parents learned about our plans, their response wasn't excitement or offers to help, but suggestions that we reconsider the expense given our financial priorities and upcoming wedding costs. The double standard had become so entrenched that my parents couldn't see how their different responses to Kevin's celebrations versus our own planning revealed their true feelings about our respective relationships and worth within the family. Structure. They had created a system where Kevin's happiness justified any expense, while my contentment required careful budget analysis and practical restraint. 2 weeks before Christmas, the mortgage payment situation created another layer of tension that would prove crucial to understanding what happened on Christmas morning. Marcus Thompson, the mortgage broker who had handled the refinance, called to discuss upcoming changes to the loan terms. The initial refinance had included a temporary payment reduction that was scheduled to expire, meaning monthly payments would increase by $400 starting in January. My parents had either forgotten about this adjustment or hoped it wouldn't materialize because they seemed genuinely surprised when Marcus explained the upcoming payment increase. The new monthly payment of $2,800 was still lower than their original mortgage, but represented a significant budget challenge given Robert's continued struggles with consistent construction work. When my father called to discuss the payment increase, his tone carried an expectation that I would simply absorb the additional $400 without complaint or discussion. The assumption that my financial responsibility would automatically expand to cover their oversight was presented as natural family obligation, rather than a significant additional burden on my already tight budget. I explained that $400 represented nearly a full day's wages from my medical assistant job, money that Tyler and I were saving toward our wedding and future together. The conversation became tense when I suggested my parents might need to adjust their own spending to accommodate the increased mortgage payment, particularly given their recent expenditures on Kevin's wedding celebrations. My father's response revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood both my financial situation and my willingness to continue enabling their irresponsible spending. He suggested that if money was tight for Tyler and me, perhaps we should postpone our wedding until we were more financially stable, while simultaneously planning to spend thousands more on Kevin's bachelor party and wedding expenses. The conversation ended with my father expressing disappointment in my attitude toward family obligations, and my mother calling later to suggest that my engagement was making me selfish and ungrateful. They seemed genuinely confused by my reluctance to absorb additional financial responsibility while they continued spending freely on Kevin's celebrations. Christmas week arrived with family tensions at their highest point in years. Kevin and Stephanie were flying in from their honeymoon preview trip to Cancun, a week-long vacation that had been an early wedding gift from my parents. Their return was being celebrated with multiple family gatherings and activities designed to showcase their wedding planning progress and Stephanie's integration into the Martinez family traditions. Meanwhile, Tyler and I were working extra shifts during the holidays to save money for our own wedding while maintaining responsibility for mortgage payments that were about to increase by $400 monthly. The contrast between Kevin's pampered celebration and our financial stress felt particularly acute during a season that was supposed to be about family togetherness and gratitude. Christmas Eve dinner at my parents' house revealed just how completely they had rewritten family history to justify their treatment of Tyler and me. During conversations about holiday traditions and family memories, my parents repeatedly referenced Kevin's childhood achievements and current successes while glossing over or omitting entirely my contributions to family stability and their current ability to maintain their lifestyle. When Tyler's parents brought up their pride in Tyler's recent promotion to full-time firefighter status, My parents' response was polite, but noticeably cooler than their enthusiasm for Kevin's latest photography bookings. The difference in energy and interest was obvious to everyone present, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that Tyler's family handled with grace, while noting the disparity for future reference. The evening ended with my parents distributing Christmas gifts that reflected their ongoing favoritism with mathematical precision. Kevin and Stephanie received multiple expensive presents, including professional camera equipment, spa weekend vouchers, and airline vouchers for future travel. Tyler and I received practical items like kitchen utensils and bath towels that felt more like household necessities than thoughtful holiday gifts. The gift disparity might have been manageable if it had been accompanied by acknowledgement of my financial contributions to the family or recognition of Tyler's career achievements. Instead, the practical nature of our gifts seemed to reinforce my parents' view of us as the responsible, stable couple who didn't require the same investment or celebration as Kevin and Stephanie's more exciting relationship. Christmas morning was supposed to be a fresh start, an opportunity for family bonding and holiday joy that might help reset the tensions that had been building for months. I arrived at my parents' house early to help with breakfast preparation and gift exchange organization, hoping that Christmas spirit might soften the edges of our recent conflicts and create space for better family dynamics. Instead, Christmas morning became the day when years of accumulated favoritism, resentment, and financial manipulation finally exploded into a confrontation that would change our family relationships forever. The events that unfolded revealed not just how my parents truly felt about Tyler and me, but how comfortable they had become taking my support for granted while treating me as a secondary family member who existed to serve their priorities rather than pursue my own happiness. What I didn't know as I walked into their house that morning was that I was about to discover exactly how far they were willing to go to maintain Kevin's preferred status, and how little regard they actually had for the daughter who had saved their home from foreclosure while enduring years of subtle emotional abuse disguised as family tradition. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear in Scottsdale, the kind of perfect Arizona winter day that makes tourists understand why people relocate to the desert. I arrived at my parents' house at 8 in the morning, carrying homemade cinnamon rolls and the coffee blend Tyler's mother had taught me to prepare, hoping that small gestures of care might help smooth over the tensions that had been building through the holiday season. The house looked magnificent in the morning light, its stucco exterior and red tile roof gleaming against the backdrop of the McDowell Mountains. The front yard featured an elaborate Christmas display that had taken my father weeks to install, complete with synchronized lights and a nativity scene that had been featured in the neighborhood holiday tour. Looking at the house that morning, knowing I was financially responsible for its continued existence while being treated as a secondary family member, created a complex mix of pride and resentment that I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Kevin and Stephanie's rental car was already in the driveway, a luxury SUV that cost more per week than Tyler and I spent on groceries. They had flown in the previous evening from their pre-honeymoon trip to Cancun, arriving with tans and designer luggage that spoke of experiences Tyler and I could only dream about on our combined income. The visual reminder of the different standards my parents maintained for their children hit me immediately as I walked toward the front door. My mother answered the door wearing a new silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly contribution to the mortgage payment, her hair and makeup already perfect despite the early hour. Her greeting was warm, but carried an undertone of expectation that I had learned to recognize over the years. I was there to help with breakfast preparation and gift organization, to serve the supporting role that allowed the favored family members to enjoy Christmas morning without worrying about logistics or cleanup. The kitchen was already bustling, with activity as my mother directed preparation for the elaborate Christmas brunch she had planned. Kevin and Stephanie were seated at the breakfast bar, sharing stories from their Cancun trip while drinking premium coffee that my mother had special ordered for their visit. They looked relaxed and pampered, the kind of carefree happiness that comes from knowing someone else will handle all the mundane responsibilities while you enjoy the pleasant moments. My father emerged from his home office carrying a stack of wrapped presents, his demeanor cheerful but focused on orchestrating the perfect family Christmas that would create memorable photos and stories to share with friends and extended family. The performance aspect of our family gatherings had become more obvious to me over recent months, the way certain moments were carefully staged to project success and harmony rather than genuinely experienced. Tyler arrived at 9:30, carrying thoughtful gifts for everyone and wearing the sweater my mother had specifically requested he wear for family photos. His greeting from my parents was polite, but noticeably cooler than their enthusiasm for Kevin and Stephanie's presence. Tyler had learned to navigate these interactions with grace, focusing his attention on being helpful and pleasant rather than seeking the acceptance that clearly wasn't forthcoming. The morning proceeded according to my mother's carefully planned schedule, with breakfast service followed by organized gift exchange in the living room. Kevin and Stephanie received their gifts first, as had become traditional, opening elaborate presents while my parents photographed every reaction and expression. The gifts they received were thoughtful and expensive, items they had specifically mentioned wanting plus surprises that demonstrated how carefully my parents paid attention to their preferences and interests. Kevin's reaction to a new camera lens that cost more than Tyler's monthly salary was genuine joy and appreciation. He understood the significance of the gift not just in monetary terms, but as validation of his photography career and his parents' belief in his artistic vision. Stephanie received jewelry and spa treatments that reinforced her status as the daughter-in-law who deserved to be pampered and celebrated. When Tyler and I opened our gifts, the contrast was stark but familiar. We received practical items that were useful but uninspiring, gifts that seemed chosen based on necessity rather than desire or personal connection. The kitchen utensils and bathroom accessories we unwrapped were nice enough, but they carried a clear message about our role in the family hierarchy and the level of thought invested in our happiness. The morning might have continued in this predictable pattern of subtle favoritism, if not for a phone call that changed everything. Marcus Thompson, the mortgage broker, called my father's cell phone at 10:45 to discuss a time-sensitive matter regarding the mortgage payment adjustment scheduled for January. My father took the call in his office, but his raised voice carried throughout the house as the conversation became increasingly tense. When my father returned to the living room, his expression was grim and his holiday cheer had evaporated completely. He announced that there had been a complication with the mortgage refinance that required immediate attention and financial decisions that couldn't wait until after the holidays. The timing was unfortunate, but Marcus had explained that certain paperwork needed to be completed before year-end to avoid penalty fees and payment increases. My mother's reaction was immediate concern about how this financial discussion might disrupt their perfect Christmas morning, while Kevin and Stephanie exchanged glances that suggested they hoped to avoid being drawn into family money problems. Tyler quietly offered to take a walk around the neighborhood to give the family privacy for their financial discussion, but my father indicated that I needed to be present since the mortgage was in my name as well. What followed was a conversation that revealed how completely my parents had misunderstood both the mortgage terms and my willingness to continue absorbing financial responsibility for their lifestyle choices. Marcus had called to explain that the temporary payment reduction was ending earlier than expected due to changes in interest rates, meaning the monthly payment would increase to $3,200 starting in January instead of the previously discussed $2,800. This represented an increase of $800 monthly from the current payment, money that would need to come from somewhere in an already tight family budget. My father's assumption was that I would simply absorb this additional cost without discussion, the same way I had handled previous financial adjustments. His presentation of the situation focused on the inconvenience to their holiday plans rather than the significant impact on my personal finances. When I explained that $800 monthly represented a substantial portion of my income and would require serious budget adjustments for Tyler and me, my parents' response revealed how fundamentally they had misunderstood our financial situation and my role in their lives. My mother suggested that Tyler and I postpone our wedding plans to redirect that money toward the increased mortgage payments, treating our future happiness as expendable compared to their housing stability. My father's approach was more direct, but equally problematic. He suggested that if I was unwilling to meet my mortgage obligations, perhaps I wasn't ready for the responsibility of co-signing in the first place. The implication that my hesitation represented immaturity or unreliability was particularly painful, given that I had already saved their house from foreclosure and had been making reliable payments for over 2 years. The conversation took a darker turn when Kevin interjected with his opinion that Tyler and I were being selfish by not immediately agreeing to absorb the additional costs. His perspective was that family obligations should take precedence over personal plans, conveniently ignoring that his own wedding celebration was costing our parents thousands of dollars that could have been applied to mortgage payments instead. Stephanie, perhaps sensing the increasing tension, suggested that everyone take a break from financial discussions to enjoy Christmas morning and address these matters after the holidays. Her diplomatic attempt to diffuse the situation was met with appreciation from Tyler, who had been watching the family dynamics with growing concern about how I was being treated. Instead of accepting Stephanie's suggestion, my mother used the interruption to launch into a speech about family loyalty and responsibility that was clearly directed at me. Her words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable while being deeply manipulative, suggesting that my reluctance to increase my financial contribution represented a fundamental change in my character since my engagement to Tyler. The speech included pointed references to how family support was supposed to be unconditional, how parents make sacrifices for their children without expecting immediate returns, and how marriage shouldn't change a person's obligations to the family that raised and supported them. Each point was designed to make me feel guilty for having boundaries around my financial contribution while ignoring the reality of how much I had already sacrificed for their stability. Tyler's growing discomfort with the conversation was visible to everyone in the room, but my parents interpreted his protective instincts as evidence that he was turning me against my family. When he gently suggested that $800 monthly was a significant amount that deserved careful consideration, my mother's response was swift and harsh. She accused Tyler of poisoning my mind against family obligations, suggesting that his influence was making me selfish and ungrateful. The attack was personal and unfair, targeting Tyler's character and our relationship rather than addressing the legitimate financial concerns we had raised. Her words carried years of accumulated resentment about Tyler's place in my life and his failure to meet their unstated expectations for my partner. My father joined the attack by questioning Tyler's career prospects and suggesting that a real man would be able to support his wife's family obligations without complaint. The comment was designed to emasculate Tyler while reinforcing traditional gender roles that positioned me as a daughter first and partner second, regardless of my age or independence. Tyler's response was measured but firm. He acknowledged the difficulty of the family's financial situation, while pointing out that I had already made significant sacrifices to help maintain their home. He suggested that perhaps the family needed to consider reducing expenses in other areas, such as wedding celebrations, rather than automatically assuming I would absorb all additional costs. The suggestion that Kevin's wedding expenses might be reduced to help with mortgage payments created an immediate and explosive reaction from my parents. My mother's face flushed with anger as she accused Tyler of trying to ruin Kevin's happiness out of jealousy and spite. My father stood up from his chair, his voice rising as he told Tyler that he had no right to comment on family financial decisions or suggest how they should spend money on their son's wedding. Kevin's reaction was equally intense, accusing Tyler of being jealous of his success and trying to manipulate me into abandoning my family responsibilities. His words were cruel and personal, attacking Tyler's background and career, while defending his own right to have his wedding funded regardless of the family's mortgage obligations. The living room erupted into multiple simultaneous arguments as years of buried resentments and financial tensions finally exploded into open conflict. My parents were yelling at Tyler about respect and boundaries, while Kevin was demanding that I choose between my family and my boyfriend. Stephanie sat in shocked silence, witnessing a level of family dysfunction that she had never experienced in her own household. In the midst of this chaos, I finally found my voice and tried to restore some sanity to the conversation. I pointed out that Tyler and I had legitimate concerns about absorbing an additional $800 monthly, especially when my parents were simultaneously spending thousands on wedding celebrations. I suggested that we needed to have a calm, rational discussion about sustainable solutions that didn't place the entire burden on my shoulders. My attempt to mediate was met with immediate hostility from my mother, who accused me of becoming argumentative and disrespectful since my engagement. She suggested that Tyler had changed me in fundamental ways that were damaging to my character and my relationship with my family. Her words carried a tone of disappointment and betrayal that cut deeply despite their unfairness. My father's response was even more devastating. He looked directly at me and said that if I was going to prioritize Tyler's opinions over family loyalty, perhaps I needed to reconsider where my true obligations lay. The threat was implicit but clear. Choose between supporting my parents financially or maintaining my relationship with Tyler. But I couldn't have both without constant conflict and guilt. The ultimatum created a moment of clarity that had been building for months. I realized that my parents had never seen me as an independent adult with legitimate needs and boundaries, but rather as a resource to be managed and manipulated for their benefit. The mortgage co-signing hadn't been appreciated as a generous gesture from a loving daughter, but rather accepted as the natural order of family hierarchy where my financial resources belonged to them by right. Tyler stepped closer to me, his presence offering support without demanding that I choose sides or respond in any particular way. His quiet strength in that moment contrasted sharply with my family's emotional manipulation and helped me understand the difference between love that supported growth and love that demanded sacrifice without reciprocation. What happened next would become the defining moment of my relationship with my parents, the point where years of accumulated disrespect and financial exploitation finally met my evolved understanding of what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. The daughter who had co-signed their mortgage to save their home was about to discover exactly how little that sacrifice meant when it came into conflict with their image of perfect family hierarchy. My mother looked at me with cold disappointment and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Get out of my house, you ungrateful disappointment." The command was delivered with finality that suggested she had been waiting for an excuse to say exactly those words, that my financial contributions and years of trying to earn acceptance had never been enough to secure genuine love or respect from the people who had raised me. Standing in that living room on Christmas morning, surrounded by the gifts I had helped make possible through my mortgage payments, looking at parents who had just chosen their pride over their daughter's dignity, I experienced a moment of absolute clarity about my worth and my power. They had forgotten that the house they were ordering me to leave was only theirs because of my signature on the mortgage documents, and that respect was a two-way street they had been traveling in the wrong direction for far too long. Tyler and I walked out of that house in complete silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. The bright Arizona sunshine felt surreal after the darkness of the confrontation we had just experienced, and I found myself mechanically going through the motions of getting into Tyler's truck without really processing where we were going or what came next. As we drove away from the neighborhood where I had grown up, Tyler reached over and took my hand, his touch gentle but firm. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances or immediate solutions, understanding that I needed time to process the magnitude of what my mother had just done. The familiar streets of Scottsdale passed by the window, but everything looked different now, filtered through the lens of being officially rejected by my own family on Christmas morning. We ended up at Tyler's apartment, a modest one-bedroom place that felt like sanctuary after the hostile environment I had just escaped. His parents were visiting relatives in Tucson for the holiday, which meant we had privacy to process what had happened without having to explain or perform normalcy for anyone else. Tyler made coffee while I sat on his couch, staring at my phone and trying to understand how a Christmas morning gift exchange had escalated into complete family rupture. The first call came at noon, barely an hour after we had left my parents' house. Kevin's name appeared on my phone screen, and something compelled me to answer, despite having no desire to continue the argument we had just escaped. His voice was different than it had been during the confrontation, less aggressive but still fundamentally unsympathetic to my position. Kevin explained that our parents were upset about how the morning had ended, but he framed their reaction as hurt feelings rather than acknowledging the cruelty of throwing their daughter out on Christmas Day. According to his version of events, I had overreacted to a simple family discussion about financial responsibilities, and Tyler had unnecessarily escalated tensions by involving himself in matters that didn't concern him. The conversation revealed how completely Kevin misunderstood both the financial dynamics of our family and the emotional impact of years of favoritism. In his mind, my co-signing the mortgage had been a minor favor rather than a major financial commitment, and my reluctance to absorb additional costs represented selfishness rather than reasonable boundary setting. He genuinely seemed to believe that I owed our parents unlimited financial support regardless of my own needs or circumstances. When I tried to explain that $800 monthly represented a significant portion of my income, Kevin's response was to suggest that Tyler and I needed to work harder or find better jobs rather than expecting our parents to reduce their own expenses. The suggestion that I should sacrifice my wedding plans and future financial stability to fund his wedding celebration was presented as reasonable family loyalty rather than the exploitative demand it actually was. The most revealing part of Kevin's call was his complete inability to see the hypocrisy in his position. He defended our parents' right to spend money on his wedding while simultaneously arguing that I was obligated to increase my mortgage contributions. The double standard was so obvious that his blindness to it could only be explained by decades of being the favored child who had never been expected to sacrifice for anyone else's benefit. When I pointed out this inconsistency, Kevin's tone shifted to anger and accusation. He suggested that my engagement had changed my personality in negative ways, making me selfish and argumentative where I had previously been supportive and accommodating. The implication that my growing boundaries and self-respect represented character flaws rather than healthy development revealed how invested he was in maintaining family dynamics that benefited him at my expense. Tyler listened to my side of the conversation with growing frustration, occasionally shaking his head at responses he could infer from Kevin's tone and my reactions. When I finally hung up, Tyler's first comment was about how Kevin seemed incapable of understanding that other people had needs and limitations that deserved consideration. The conversation had confirmed Tyler's long-standing concerns about my family's treatment of me and their expectations of unlimited sacrifice. The second call came from Stephanie 2 hours later, and her approach was more diplomatic but ultimately just as problematic. She expressed sympathy for the difficult situation, while suggesting that family relationships required compromise and forgiveness from all parties. Her perspective was that Christmas morning emotions had run high for everyone, and perhaps some cooling-off time would allow for more productive conversations about solutions. Stephanie's call revealed her genuine discomfort with the family dynamics she had witnessed, but also her investment in maintaining peace that would allow her wedding plans to proceed without disruption. She was caught between recognizing the unfairness of my treatment and wanting to avoid family conflict that might affect her own position within the Martinez hierarchy. When Stephanie suggested that I might consider apologizing for my role in escalating the morning's tensions, I realized how completely she misunderstood the power dynamics at play. Her suggestion that I bear responsibility for being thrown out of my parents' house on Christmas revealed how thoroughly my parents had managed to frame themselves as the injured parties rather than the aggressors who had crossed fundamental lines of basic respect. The conversation with Stephanie was more painful than Kevin's call because it came from someone I had hoped might understand the situation more objectively. Her inability to see that my parents had behaved unacceptably regardless of the financial pressures they were facing, confirmed that even sympathetic family members were more invested in maintaining harmony than supporting justice or accountability. By evening, Tyler and I had received multiple messages from extended family members who had heard various versions of the morning's events. The narrative being circulated painted me as the ungrateful daughter who had refused to help her struggling parents, while Tyler was portrayed as the manipulative boyfriend who had turned me against my family obligations. The speed and consistency of this messaging revealed how quickly my parents had mobilized their support network to control the story. Aunt Grace, my father's sister, called that evening with a different perspective that provided crucial context for understanding the larger family dynamics. Grace had maintained distance from my parents for years due to her own conflicts with their treatment of family members, and she had witnessed similar patterns of favoritism and financial manipulation in previous generations of the Martinez family. According to Grace, my grandfather had used similar tactics with his children, creating financial dependencies that he leveraged to control their decisions and maintain family hierarchy according to his preferences. My father had experienced this manipulation firsthand as a young man, making his replication of the same patterns with his own children particularly tragic and predictable. Grace's most important revelation was about the true state of my parents' finances, information she had gathered through her connections in the local business community. Robert's construction company was struggling more severely than he had admitted, with multiple outstanding debts and contract disputes that threatened the business's viability. The mortgage payment increase was just one of several financial pressures that were pushing my parents toward potential bankruptcy. This context helped explain the desperation behind my parents' assumption that I would absorb additional mortgage costs without question. They weren't just asking for help with a temporary inconvenience, but rather expecting me to subsidize a lifestyle they could no longer afford while maintaining appearances that would preserve their social standing and Kevin's wedding celebration. Grace also shared her perspective on my parents' treatment of Tyler, explaining that their hostility stemmed from fear that he would support my independence in ways that threatened their financial dependency on me. Tyler's encouragement of my boundaries and self-respect represented a direct challenge to the family system that required my compliance and sacrifice to function effectively. The conversation with Grace provided emotional validation that I desperately needed after a day of being painted as the villain in my own family's narrative. Her confirmation that my parents' behavior was manipulative and unreasonable helped counter the gaslighting I had experienced throughout the day from family members who insisted I was overreacting or misunderstanding the situation. Monday morning brought a call from Marcus Thompson, the mortgage broker, who had been trying to reach my parents about completing the paperwork for the payment adjustment. His conversation with me revealed details about the mortgage terms that fundamentally changed my understanding of my legal position and options regarding the loan. Marcus explained that as the co-signer, I had equal legal standing with my parents regarding all mortgage decisions, including the right to modify terms, request information, or even initiate foreclosure proceedings if payments became delinquent. The mortgage documents I had signed gave me significant power over the loan that I had never fully understood or exercised. More importantly, Marcus revealed that my parents had been misleading me about the necessity of the payment increase. While interest rate changes had affected the loan terms, there were several modification options available that could maintain lower payments through extended loan terms or other adjustments. My parents had apparently chosen the option that maximized their monthly cash flow while shifting the burden to me, rather than exploring alternatives that might require them to adjust their own spending. This information was devastating because it revealed that my parents had deliberately manipulated me into believing I had no choice but to absorb additional costs, when in reality, multiple options existed for managing the mortgage adjustments. Their presentation of the situation as an unavoidable crisis requiring my immediate financial sacrifice had been a calculated deception designed to avoid having to make difficult choices about their own lifestyle and spending priorities. Marcus also mentioned that my parents had inquired about removing me from the mortgage entirely, which would require refinancing the loan under different terms that might not be favorable given Robert's current financial situation and credit challenges. The fact that they had explored removing me while simultaneously demanding increased payments revealed the extent to which they viewed me as a convenient financial resource rather than a family member deserving honest communication and consideration. Armed with this new information about my legal rights and my parents' deception, I began to understand that I had significantly more power in this situation than I had realized. The mortgage that had made me feel trapped and obligated actually provided me with leverage that could fundamentally change the family dynamics if I chose to exercise it. Tyler and I spent Monday evening discussing the implications of what Marcus had revealed and considering our options for moving forward. Tyler's perspective was that my parents had forfeited any claim to my continued financial support through their treatment of me, but he emphasized that whatever decisions I made needed to be based on what I could live with long-term, rather than immediate anger or hurt. The question wasn't whether my parents deserved my continued support, but rather what course of action would best serve my own emotional and financial well-being while maintaining my integrity and values. Tyler's approach was to help me think through the consequences of various choices, rather than pushing me toward any particular decision, understanding that I needed to own whatever path I chose. Tuesday brought another call from Kevin, this time with a more urgent tone that revealed growing anxiety about the financial situation at home. His conversation suggested that my parents were facing additional financial pressures beyond the mortgage adjustment, and that my absence from their support system was creating stress about their ability to maintain their current lifestyle and wedding expenditures. Kevin's call was designed to pressure me into returning to the family fold through guilt and obligation, but his desperation actually confirmed that my financial contributions had been more crucial to the family's stability than they had ever acknowledged. The panicked undertone in his voice suggested that my parents were beginning to understand the true cost of throwing away their relationship with their most reliable source of support. When Kevin suggested that I was putting the family's financial security at risk out of spite, I realized that he still completely misunderstood the situation. In his mind, my money belonged to the family by right, and my refusal to continue subsidizing their lifestyle represented theft rather than reasonable boundary setting by someone who had been exploited and mistreated. The conversation with Kevin revealed that my parents had not told him about Marcus Thompson's call or the various mortgage modification options that were available. They had maintained the fiction that I was the only solution to their financial challenges, preserving their victim narrative while avoiding having to explain their deceptive presentation of the situation to me. By Wednesday, I had made my decision about how to respond to my parents' treatment and their ongoing financial manipulation. The choice wasn't made in anger or spite, but rather from a clear understanding of my own worth and my refusal to continue enabling behavior that was destructive to my well-being and future happiness. I called Marcus Thompson and requested a complete review of the mortgage terms and my options as co-signer. What I learned during that conversation would give me the power to respond to my parents' Christmas morning cruelty in a way that would force them to confront the true consequences of their choices and the real value of the daughter they had just thrown away. Marcus Thompson's office felt like neutral territory as Tyler and I sat across from him on Thursday morning, reviewing documents that would fundamentally alter my family's financial landscape. The mortgage papers spread across his desk represented more than just loan terms and payment schedules. They were the legal foundation that would allow me to respond to my parents' cruelty with consequences they had never imagined possible. The conversation with Marcus revealed options I hadn't known existed, including my right as co-signer to request immediate full payment of the loan balance if I believed the primary borrowers were acting in bad faith or creating financial risk. Given my parents' deception about available payment modification options and their apparent plan to remove me from the mortgage while demanding increased contributions, Marcus confirmed that I had grounds to exercise this nuclear option. More practically, I learned that I could force a refinance under terms of my choosing, require the property to be sold to satisfy the loan, or demand immediate assumption of full financial responsibility by my parents without my continued involvement. Each option carried different implications and consequences, but all of them would strip away the financial security my parents had taken for granted, while treating me as expendable. Tyler listened quietly as Marcus explained the legal mechanics of each choice, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and procedures. His presence provided emotional support without trying to influence my decision, understanding that this choice needed to be entirely mine. When Marcus finished his explanation, the power dynamic between my family and me had been completely reversed. I chose the most direct approach. Marcus prepared a formal notice demanding immediate refinance of the mortgage under my parents' names alone, removing me from all financial obligation while requiring them to qualify for the loan independently within 30 days. If they couldn't meet this requirement, the house would need to be sold to satisfy the outstanding balance, with any proceeds divided according to our respective contributions to the down payment and improvements. The legal notice was comprehensive and unambiguous, explaining that my decision was based on their misrepresentation of available options, their attempts to increase my financial obligations without consent, and their breach of the implicit agreement that co-signing would be temporary assistance rather than permanent subsidy. Marcus ensured that the language was professional but firm, leaving no room for negotiation or delay. The notice was served to my parents on Thursday afternoon by certified mail, with copies sent to their attorney and the current mortgage company. The 30-day clock began ticking immediately, creating urgency that would force them to confront their financial reality without the safety net they had taken for granted. Marcus estimated that given Robert's current credit situation and irregular income, qualifying for a new mortgage would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. My phone began ringing within hours of the notice being delivered, but I had made the decision to let all calls from family members go to voicemail while I processed my feelings about the step I had just taken. The voicemails that accumulated over the next few hours provided a fascinating timeline of my parents' emotional journey from confusion to panic to desperate attempts at manipulation. The first message came from my mother, her voice controlled, but strained as she asked me to call her immediately about some legal documents that had been delivered by mistake. Her tone suggested she believed this was some kind of clerical error that could be resolved through a simple phone conversation, revealing how completely she had underestimated both my knowledge of the mortgage terms and my willingness to exercise my legal rights. My father's message followed 2 hours later, his approach more direct but equally delusional about the situation. He demanded that I contact Marcus Thompson immediately to withdraw whatever complaint or action I had initiated, insisting that family matters should be resolved privately rather than through legal channels. His assumption that I would comply with his demands, even after being thrown out of their house, demonstrated how thoroughly he had internalized his right to control my decisions and behavior. Kevin's voicemail was the most revealing, his voice carrying panic as he begged me to reconsider whatever I was doing to threaten the family's financial stability. His message included specific references to the wedding expenses that would be jeopardized if my parents lost their house, revealing that he finally understood the connection between my financial support and his privileged lifestyle. The fear in his voice was satisfying in a way that surprised me with its intensity. Tyler and I spent Thursday evening at his apartment, ordering takeout and watching old movies while my phone continued to accumulate increasingly desperate messages from various family members. The contrast between the peaceful evening we were sharing and the chaos I had unleashed felt surreal but appropriate. For the first time in years, I was prioritizing my own well-being over my family's comfort, and the freedom was intoxicating. Friday brought a personal visit from Aunt Grace, who had driven over from Tempe after hearing about the legal notice from other family members. Her perspective on the situation was more nuanced than the panic-driven responses I had been receiving, and she provided valuable context about the long-term implications of the choice I had made. Grace explained that my parents' financial situation was even more precarious than I had understood, with Robert's construction business facing potential bankruptcy due to several lawsuit and unpaid contractor obligations. The house had been their primary asset and source of security, but it was also heavily leveraged and dependent on my continued co-signing to remain viable. My decision to withdraw support was likely to trigger a cascade of financial consequences that would extend far beyond the mortgage. According to Grace, my parents had been living beyond their means for several years, using credit and refinancing to maintain a lifestyle that Robert's irregular income couldn't support. Kevin's wedding expenses and ongoing support for his photography business had accelerated their financial decline, but they had hidden the severity of their situation from most family members through careful management of appearances and selective sharing of information. Grace's most important insight was about the psychological impact my decision would have on my parents, particularly my father, who had built his identity around providing financial security for his family. The forced recognition that he had driven away his most reliable source of support through his own cruelty would be devastating to his self-concept and his standing within the extended family and social community. She didn't try to talk me out of my decision, but rather helped me understand the full scope of what I had set in motion and prepared me for the various ways my parents might try to manipulate me into reversing course. Her support meant everything, during a time when most of my family was painting me as vindictive and unreasonable for refusing to continue subsidizing my own mistreatment. Saturday brought the first attempt at direct negotiation, with my mother showing up at Tyler's apartment complex at 7 a.m. She looked haggard and desperate, her usual perfect appearance replaced by obvious signs of stress and sleepless nights. Tyler answered the door but didn't invite her inside, instead stepping outside to have the conversation in the parking lot where neighbors might overhear if things became heated. My mother's approach was pure emotional manipulation, beginning with tears and apologies that felt calculated rather than genuine. She claimed that Christmas morning had been a misunderstanding caused by holiday stress and financial pressures, and that she had never meant for me to leave or feel unwelcome. In the family home, her version of events carefully omitted the deliberate cruelty of her words and the years of favoritism that had led to that moment. When emotional appeals failed to move me, she shifted to practical concerns about the impact my decision would have on Kevin's wedding and the family's reputation within their social circle. The suggestion that I was punishing innocent family members for a simple disagreement revealed how completely she misunderstood both the severity of her behavior and my motivations for responding as I had. My mother's final approach was to offer compromises that demonstrated her continued refusal to acknowledge the fundamental problems in our relationship. She suggested that I could remain on the mortgage with reduced payment obligations, or that Tyler and I could move into the house, rent-free to help with expenses, or that they could pay for a modest wedding for us if I withdrew the legal notice. Each offer revealed her assumption that my decision was primarily financial rather than emotional, and that she could buy her way out of the consequences of years of psychological abuse. When I declined all of her offers and refused to discuss, reversing my decision, my mother's mask finally slipped to reveal the manipulative anger beneath her apparent desperation. She accused me of destroying the family out of spite, suggested that Tyler had brainwashed me into turning against my own parents, and threatened that I would regret my decision when I needed family support in the future. The threats confirmed that her earlier apologies had been tactical rather than genuine, and that she still viewed me as a resource to be controlled rather than a person deserving respect. Tyler's support during this confrontation was invaluable, providing a calm presence that prevented the situation from escalating while making it clear that I wasn't alone or vulnerable to my mother's manipulation. His quiet strength reminded me that I had people in my life who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, making it easier to resist the familiar patterns of guilt and obligation that my mother was trying to activate. Sunday brought a family meeting that I wasn't invited to attend, but Grace provided detailed information about the discussions and decisions that emerged. My parents, Kevin and Stephanie, had met with a financial advisor to explore options for qualifying for a new mortgage or finding alternative housing arrangements that would allow them to avoid losing the house. The meeting had apparently been contentious, with Kevin finally confronting the reality that his wedding expenses would need to be drastically reduced if the family was facing potential homelessness. Stephanie had suggested postponing the wedding entirely, a proposal that triggered emotional breakdown from my mother and angry resistance from Kevin, who felt he shouldn't have to sacrifice his happiness for family financial problems he hadn't created. My father's response to the crisis was to explore selling his construction business to generate enough cash for a down payment on a smaller house. But preliminary discussions with potential buyers had revealed that the business's debts and legal complications made it worth significantly less than he had believed. The recognition that his life's work wouldn't provide the financial security he had counted on was devastating to his sense of identity and competence. According to Grace, the most significant development was my parents' growing recognition that they had systematically destroyed their relationship with the family member most capable of helping them through their financial crisis. The irony of having thrown away their most reliable source of support in favor of a son whose wedding expenses were accelerating their financial decline was not lost on the extended family members who were now being asked to provide assistance. Monday brought the most surprising development of all, a call from Stephanie asking if she could meet with me privately to discuss the family situation. Her request was unusual given that we had never had a relationship independent of her connection to Kevin, but something in her tone suggested genuine concern rather than another attempt at manipulation on behalf of my parents. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, neutral territory where we could speak freely without family oversight or interference. Stephanie's appearance shocked me. She looked exhausted and stressed in ways that revealed how much the family crisis was affecting her personally and her relationship with Kevin. Her perspective on the situation was eye-opening because it came from someone who had witnessed the family dynamics as an outsider before gradually being drawn into the dysfunction. She confirmed that my parents' treatment of me had made her uncomfortable from the beginning, but that she had initially attributed it to traditional family hierarchies rather than recognizing it as systematic emotional abuse. Stephanie's most important revelation was about Kevin's reaction to losing the financial support I had provided. Rather than developing empathy for the position I had been put in, he had become increasingly angry and resentful about having to adjust his expectations and lifestyle. His response to the crisis had been to blame me for the family's problems, rather than acknowledging his own role in creating unsustainable financial pressures. According to Stephanie, Kevin's reaction to the wedding budget cuts had revealed character, traits that concerned her about their future together. His assumption that his happiness should take priority over everyone else's financial stability, combined with his inability to see how his parents' treatment of me had contributed to the current crisis, suggested a level of selfishness and entitlement that she hadn't fully recognized during their engagement. Stephanie's most surprising admission was that she was reconsidering the wedding timeline and possibly the engagement itself, not because of the financial pressures, but because of what the crisis had revealed about Kevin's character and the Martinez family dynamics. She had entered the relationship believing she was joining a close, supportive family, but the events of the past week had shown her a level of dysfunction and cruelty that she wasn't prepared to accept as normal. When she asked for my perspective on whether the family dynamics could be repaired, or if the patterns of favoritism and manipulation were too entrenched to change, I realized that Stephanie was facing her own moment of clarity about what she was willing to accept in the name of love and family loyalty. Her questions reminded me of my own journey toward understanding that walking away from toxicity was sometimes the healthiest choice available. Tuesday marked the midpoint of the 30-day deadline I had imposed, and the pressure on my parents to find alternative financing was intensifying. Marcus Thompson called to update me on their efforts, which had been unsuccessful due to Robert's credit issues and the business's unstable income. Every mortgage broker they had contacted had declined their application, leaving them with limited options for maintaining ownership of the house. The reality of potentially losing their home was finally forcing my parents to confront the true cost of their treatment of me, but their response remained focused on finding ways to manipulate me into reversing my decision rather than acknowledging the legitimacy of my grievances or making genuine changes to repair our relationship. Wednesday brought a final desperate attempt from my father, who showed up at my workplace during my lunch break to make one last appeal. His appearance at the medical clinic where I worked was embarrassing and inappropriate, creating a scene that required security intervention and demonstrated how completely he had abandoned normal boundaries in his desperation to maintain control over the situation. My father's appeal was a mixture of threats and promises that revealed his continued inability to understand why his behavior had been unacceptable or what would be required to repair our relationship. He offered to pay for Tyler's fire academy training, promised to treat me with more respect in the future, and suggested that we could establish a written agreement about family financial obligations that would protect my interests while maintaining my support for the mortgage. When these offers failed to move me, my father's approach became more aggressive, suggesting that I was being manipulated by Tyler and that my decision would ultimately hurt me more than anyone else. His assumption that I was incapable of making independent decisions or understanding the consequences of my choices revealed the fundamental disrespect that had characterized our relationship for years. Security had to escort my father from the medical clinic when he refused to leave after I declined to discuss the situation further. The public nature of his desperation was humiliating for both of us, but it also demonstrated to my coworkers and supervisors that I had legitimate reasons for maintaining distance from family members who couldn't respect basic boundaries around my professional life. The final week of the 30-day deadline passed quickly, with my parents' attempts to secure alternative financing becoming increasingly frantic and unsuccessful. According to Grace, who continued to monitor the situation, my parents had exhausted all conventional options and were considering desperate measures like borrowing against Robert's life insurance or asking extended family members to co-sign a new mortgage. Kevin's wedding plans had been canceled entirely, with Stephanie ultimately deciding that she couldn't marry into a family system that was so fundamentally dysfunctional and emotionally abusive. Her decision to end their engagement came as a shock to everyone except me, because I understood that witnessing the Martinez family crisis had given her crucial insight into the values and dynamics she would be accepting as permanent parts of her life. The final day of the deadline arrived with no resolution to my parents' financial crisis and no genuine attempt to repair our relationship through acknowledgement of their behavior or commitment to change. Marcus Thompson called to confirm that no qualifying application had been submitted, and that the house would need to be listed for sale immediately to satisfy the mortgage obligations. The forced sale of their home represented more than just a change in living arrangements. It was the complete collapse of the lifestyle and social standing that had motivated years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. My parents were facing the natural consequences of prioritizing appearances over relationships and of taking for granted the very person who had made their security possible. Tyler and I received notification that the house sale process would take several months, during which my parents would need to find alternative housing and liquidate assets to cover their debts. The proceeds from the sale would barely cover the outstanding mortgage balance, leaving them with little equity to purchase another home and forcing them to rent or move in with relatives. 6 months later, Tyler and I were married in a small ceremony surrounded by people who genuinely supported our happiness rather than demanding sacrifices from us. My parents were not invited, a decision that felt liberating rather than sad. Grace attended as my family representative, along with Tyler's warm and loving parents who had embraced me completely from the beginning. Kevin attempted to contact me several times during our engagement period, apparently hoping to rebuild our relationship, now that Stephanie had left him and his privileged position in the family had lost its meaning. His messages suggested that he was finally beginning to understand how his behavior had contributed to the family crisis, but his apologies felt too little and too late to repair the damage that had been done. My parents eventually moved into a small rental apartment in a less expensive part of Phoenix, their lifestyle dramatically reduced, but their relationship with each other apparently intact. According to Grace, They had not taken responsibility for their role in destroying our family relationships, instead, maintaining that I had overreacted to minor disagreements and that Tyler had turned me against them. Standing in our new apartment, 6 months after that devastating Christmas morning, I realized that walking away from my family's toxicity had been the most liberating decision of my adult life. The daughter who had co-signed their mortgage to save their house had discovered that her own happiness and dignity were worth more than any family loyalty that required her to accept abuse in silence. The mortgage cancellation had been about more than money or revenge. It had been about refusing to enable people who confused love with control and who had forgotten that respect must be mutual to be meaningful. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give toxic family members is the natural consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are devastating and permanent. Tyler and I built our life together on foundations of mutual respect and genuine support, creating the family dynamics that I had always wanted but had never experienced growing up. The contrast between our healthy relationship and the manipulation I had escaped became more obvious with time, confirming that walking away had been the right choice regardless of the cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.